Little Friend by Donna Tartt.
My father was a keeper of the Eddystone Light, and he married a mermaid one fine night. Of this union there came three, a porpoise and a porgy, and the third was me, singing yo-ho-ho, the wind blows free, oh, for the life of the rolling sea. One night, as I was a-trimming of the glim, singing a verse from the evening, a voice from the starboard shouted, ahoy! There was my mother sitting on a buoy. Where the rest of my children three? My mother then she asked of me. One was exhibited as a talking fish, the other was served from a chafing dish, singing yo-ho-ho, the wind blows free, oh, for the life of the rolling sea.
36.
Then the phosphorus flashed in her seaweed hair. I looked again and my mother wasn't there. But a voice came echoing back in the night, to divil with the keeper of the Eddystone Light, to divil with the keeper of the Eddystone Light, singing yo-ho-ho,
Yo!
the wind blows free, oh, for the life on the rolling sea.
All right, bruvs. We're back with The Little Friend by Donna Tartt. As I previously said, this is episode number 36. Pages 515 to 530. I will start them as soon as I set this up and open the chat. All right, you're not saving it? Let's see what you did here, buddy. All right, we're going to open this. I don't know. There, it's saved. Bogging down this poor little computer. There's Mrs. Donna Tartt. I don't know if she's a Mrs. or a Miss or what she is. I know one thing, this book isn't going to hold this much longer. All right, let me open the chat. I'll start. The hospital waiting room was unstable and shimmery, like a dream. Everything was too bright, sparkling clean on the surface, but the chairs were worn and grubby if you looked too close. Allison was reading a raggedy children's magazine, and a pair of official-looking ladies with name tags were trying to talk to a slack-faced old man across the aisle. He was slumped forward heavily in his chair, as if drunk, staring at the floor, his hands between his knees, and his jaunty, Tyrolean-looking hat tipped down over one eye. Well, you can't tell her a thing, he was saying, shaking his head. She won't slow down for the world. The ladies looked at each other. One of them sat down beside the old man. Then it was dark and Harriet was walking alone in a strange town with tall buildings. She had to take some books back to the library before it closed, but the streets got narrower and narrower until finally they were only a foot wide. And she found herself standing in front of a large pile of stones. I need to find a telephone, she thought. Harriet? It was Edie. She was standing up now. A nurse had emerged from a swinging door in the back, pushing an empty wheelchair before her. She was a young nurse, plump and pretty, with black mascara and eyeliner drawn in fanciful wings and lots of rouge. That's a bad look, by the way, the fanciful wings and the mascara ringing the outer edge of her eye socket, a rosy semicircle from cheekbone to brow bone, and it made her look, thought Harriet, like pictures of the painted singers in the Peking opera. Rainy afternoons at Taddy's house, lying on the floor with Kabuki Theater of Japan, an illustrated Marco Polo of 1880, Kubla Khan on a painted palanquin, masks and dragons, gilt pages, and tissue paper, all Japan and China in the narrow mission bookcase at the foot of the stair. No, it's not supper time. I just need a paperweight. Down the bright hall they floated. The tower, the body in the water, had already faded into a kind of distant dream. Nothing left of it but her stomach ache, which was fierce, spikes of pain that stabbed and receded, and the terrible pain in her head. The water was what had made her sick, and she knew that she needed to tell them. They needed to know so they could make her better, but I mustn't tell, she thought. I can't. The certainty flooded her with a dreamy, settled feeling. As the nurse pushed Harriet down the shiny spaceship corridor, she reached down to pat Harriet's cheek, and Harriet, being ill and more malleable than usual, permitted this without complaint. It was a soft, cool hand with gold rings. All right, the nurse inquired as she wheeled Harriet. Number 1 Kevin Durant fan. Great. All right, the nurse inquired as she wheeled Harriet, Edie clicking rapidly behind, footsteps echoing on the tile to a small, semi-private area, and jerked the curtain. Harriet suffered herself to be got into a gown, and then lay down on the crackly paper and let the nurse take her temperature. My goodness. Yes, she's a sick girl, and draw her blood. Then she sat up and obediently drank a tinny cup of chalky-tasting medicine that the nurse said would help her stomach. Edie sat on a stool opposite near a glass case of medicine, an upright scale with a sliding back. There they were by themselves after the nurse had pulled the curtain and walked away, and Edie asked the question. Oh no, my child's going to keep texting now while I'm reading. Sorry, child, you're going to have to wait. I'm in the midst of reading. Edie sat on a stool opposite near a glass case of medicine and an upright scale with a sliding balance. There they were by themselves after the nurse had pulled the curtain and walked away. And Edie asked a question which Harriet only half answered, because she was partly in the room with the chalky medicine taste in her mouth, but at the same time swimming in a cold river that had an evil silver sheen like light-off petroleum. Moonlight and an undercurrent grabbed her legs and swept her away. Some horrible old man in a wet fur running along the banks and shouting out words that she couldn't bear. All right, sit up, please. Harriet found herself looking up into the face of a white-coated stranger. He was not an American, but an Indian from India, with blue-black hair and droopy, melancholy eyes. He asked her if she knew her name and where she was. Shone a pointy light in her face, looked into her eyes and nose and ears, felt her stomach and under her armpits with icy cold hands that made her squirm. Her first seizure, again that word, yes. Did you smell or taste anything funny? The doctor asked Harriet. His steady black eyes made her uneasy. Harriet shook her head no. Delicately, the doctor turned her chin up with his forefinger. Harriet saw his nostrils flare. Does your throat hurt? He asked in his buttery voice. From far away, she heard Edie exclaim, "Good heavens, what's that on her neck?" Discoloration, said the doctor, stroking it with his fingertips and then pressing hard with the thumb. Does this hurt? Harriet made an indistinct noise. It wasn't her throat which hurt so much as her neck, and her nose, struck by the gun's kick, was bitterly tender to the touch. But though it felt very swollen, no one else seemed to have noticed it. The doctor listened to Harriet's heart and made her stick her tongue out. With fixed intensity, he looked down her throat with a light. Uncomfortably, jaw aching, Harriet cut her eyes over to the swab dispenser and disinfectant jar on the adjacent table. Okay, said the doctor with a sigh, removing the depressor. Harriet lay down. Sharply, her stomach twisted itself and cramped. The light pulsed orange through her closed eyelids. Edie and the doctor were talking. The neurologist comes every 2 weeks, he was saying. Maybe he could drive up from Jackson tomorrow or the next day. Ani talked in his monotonous voice. Another stab in Harriet's stomach, a horrible one that made her curl up on her side and clutch her abdomen. Then it stopped. Okay, thought Harriet, weak and grateful with relief. It's over now, it's over. Harriet, Edie said loudly, so loudly Harriet realized she must have fallen asleep, or just narrowly. Look at me. Obligingly, Harriet opened her eyes to painful brightness. Look at her eyes. See how red they are? They look infected. The symptoms are questionable. We'll have to wait until the tests come back. Harriet's stomach twisted again violently. She rolled on her stomach away from the light. She knew why her eyes were red. The water had burned them. What about the diarrhea and the fever? And good Lord, those black marks on her neck. It looks like somebody's taken and choked her, if you ask me. There may be an infection of some sort, but the seizures aren't febrile. I know what it means. I was a nurse, sir, said Edie curtly. Well, then, you should know that any dysfunction of the nervous system is the first priority, replied the doctor just as curtly. And the other symptoms are questionable, as I said. First, we'll give her an antibiotic and start her on some fluids. We should have her electrolytes and her blood count back by tomorrow afternoon. Harriet was now following the conversation closely, waiting for her turn to talk. But finally, she couldn't wait any longer, and she blurted, I have to go. Edie and the doctor turned and looked at her. Well, go ahead, go, said the doctor, flicking his hand in what was to Harriet a kingly and exotic gesture, lifting his throat like a maharaja. As she hopped off the table, she heard him call for a nurse. But there was no nurse outside the curtain, and none came. And Harriet, desperate, struck off down the hall. A different nurse, her eyes as small and twinkly as an elephant's, lumbered out from behind the desk. Are you looking for something? She said. Creakily, sluggishly, she reached for Harriet's hand. Harriet, panicked by her slowness, shook her head and darted off. As she skimmed lightheaded down the windowless hall, her attention was fully fixed on the door at the end of the corridor that said ladies, and she hurried past an alcove with some chairs. She didn't stop to look when she thought she heard a voice calling, Hat! Then suddenly was Curtis, stepping out in front of her, behind him, with his hand on Curtis's shoulder, and the mark on his face standing out blood red like a bullseye, stood the preacher. Thunderstorms, rattlesnakes, all in black. Harriet stared, then she turned and ran down the bright, antiseptic hallway. The floor was slick, her feet skidded from under her, and forward she pitched onto her face, rolling onto her back, and throwing a hand over her eyes. Fast footsteps, rubber shoes squeaking on the tile, and the next thing Harriet knew, her original nurse, the young one, with the rings and the colorful makeup, was kneeling beside her. Bonnie Fenton read her name tag. Upsy daisy, she said in the cheery voice. Hurt yourself? Harriet clung to her arm, stared into the nurse's brightly painted face with all her concentration. Bonnie Fenton, she repeated to herself. Name was a magic formula to keep her safe. Bonnie Fenton, Bonnie Fenton, Bonnie Fenton, RN. This is why we're not supposed to run in the hall, said the nurse. She was talking not to Harriet, but stagily to a third party. And down the hall, Harriet saw Edie and the doctor emerging from the curtain enclosure. Feeling the eyes of the preacher burning into her neck, Harriet scrambled up and ran to Edie and threw her arms around Edie's waist. Edie, she cried, take me home, take me home. Harriet, what's got into you? If you go home, said the doctor, how can we find out what's wrong with you? He was trying to be friendly, but his droopy face had a waxen, melted look under the eye sockets that was suddenly very frightening. Harriet began to cry. Abstracted pat on her back, very Edie-like, that pat brisk and businesslike, and it only made Harriet cry harder. She's out of her head. Usually they're sleepy after a seizure, but if she's fretful, we can give her a little something to help her relax. Fearfully, Harriet glanced over her shoulder, but the hall was empty. She reached down and touched her knee, which hurt from skidding on the floor. She'd been running from somebody. She'd fallen and hurt herself. That part was true, not something she'd dreamed. Nurse Bonnie was disengaging Harriet from Edie. Nurse Bonnie was leading Harriet back to the curtain room. Nurse Bonnie was unlatching a cabinet, filling a syringe from a little glass bottle. Edie, screamed Harriet. Harriet, Edie poked her head through the curtain. Don't be silly, it's just a shot. Her voice sent Harriet into a fresh hiccuping of tears. Edie, she said, Edie, take me home. I'm scared. I'm scared. I can't stay here. Those people are after me. She turned her head. She winced as the nurse pushed the needle in her arm. Then she was sliding off the table, but the nurse seized her wrist. No, we're not finished yet, honey. Edie, no, I don't want that, she said, recoiling from Nurse Bonnie, who had circled to the other side and was coming at her with a new syringe. Politely, but without much amusement, the nurse laughed at this while casting her eyes over to Edie for assistance. I don't want to go to sleep. I don't want to go to sleep, Harriet cried, all at once surrounded, shrugging off Edie on the one side, and Nurse Bonnie's soft, insistent gold ring grasp on the other. I'm afraid I'm not of this little needle, sweet. Nurse Bonnie's voice, soothing at first, had turned cool and a little frightening. Don't be silly, just a little pinch. And Edie said, well, I'm just going to run home. Edie, let's keep our voice down, sugar, said the nurse as she stuck the needle in Harriet's arm and pushed the plunger home. Edie, no, they're here. Don't leave me. Don't. I'll be back. Listen to me, said Edie, raising her chin, her voice cutting sharp and efficient above Harriet's panicked blithering. I've got to take Allison home, and then I'll just stop at my house for a few things. She turned to the nurse. Will you set up a cot in her room? Certainly, ma'am. Harriet rubbed the stung place on her arm. Cot. The word had a comforting nursery sound, like poppet, like cotton, like Harriet's old baby nickname, Hottentot. She could almost taste it on her tongue, that round, sweet word, smooth and hard, dark like a malted milk ball. She smiled at the smiling face around the table. Somebody's sleeping now, she heard Nurse Bonnie say. Where was Edie? Harriet fought hard to keep her eyes open. Immense skies weighed upon her, clouds rushing in a fabulous darkness. Harriet closed her eyes and saw tree branches tossing, and before she knew it, she was asleep. Eugene roamed the chilly halls, hands clasped behind his back, when at last an orderly arrived and wheeled the child out of the examination room. He sauntered behind at a safe distance to see where they took her. The orderly stopped by the elevator and pressed the button. Eugene turned and went back down the hall to the stairs. Emerging from the echoing stairwell on the second floor, he heard the bell ding, and then down the hall. The gurney emerged feet first through the stainless steel doors, the orderly maneuvering at the head. Down the hall they glided. Eugene closed the metal fire door as quietly as he could, and, shoes clicking, strolled after them at a discreet distance. From a safe remove, he took note of the room they turned into. Then he wandered away back towards the elevator and had a long look at an exhibition of children's drawings pinned on the bulletin board, also at the illumined candies in the humming snack machine. He'd always heard it said that dogs howled before an earthquake. Well, lately, when anything bad had happened or was about to, this black-headed child was somewhere close by, and it was the child, no question. He'd got a good long look at her out in front of the mission the night he got bit. And here she was again, casually past her open door and stole a brief glance inside. A low light glowed from a ceiling recess, deepening gradually into shadow. Little was visible in the bed, but a small huddle of covers. Above, up towards the light, like a jellyfish hanging in still water, floated a translucent IV bag of clear fluid with a tentacle trailing down. Eugene walked to the water fountain, had a drink, stood around for a while examining a display for the March of Dimes. From his post, he watched the nurse come and go, but when Eugene moseyed up to the room again and stuck his head in at the open door, he saw that the girl was not alone. A black orderly was fussing about, setting up a cot, and he was not at all responsive to Eugene's questions. Eugene loitered, trying not to look too conspicuous, though, of course, that was difficult in the empty hall, and when at last he saw the nurse returning with her arms full of sheets, he stopped her going in the door. Who is that child in there?" he asked in his friendliest voice. "Harriet's her name, belongs to some people named Dufresne's." Ah, the name rang a bell. He wasn't sure why. He looked past the nurse into the room. "Ain't she got nobody with her?" "I haven't seen the parents, only the grandmother. The nurse turned with an air of finality. Poor little thing, said Eugene, reluctant to let the conversation go, putting his head in the door. What's the matter with her? Before she said a word, Eugene knew from the look on her face that he'd gone too far. I'm sorry, I'm not allowed to give out that information. Eugene smiled, engaging. I meant hi, I'm so sorry. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm not allowed to give out that information. Eugene smiled engagingly, he hoped. You know, he said, I know this mark on my face ain't very handsome, but it don't make me a bad person. Women tended to cave in a little when Eugene referred to his infirmity, but the nurse only looked at him as if he'd said something in Spanish. Just asking, said Eugene amiably, holding up a hand. Sorry to bother you, ma'am, he said, stepping after her, but the nurse was busy with the sheets. He thought of offering to help, but the set of her back warned him that he better not push his luck. Eugene drifted back towards the candy machine. Dufresne. Why did he know that name? Farish was the person to ask about this sort of thing. Farish knew who was who in town. Farish remembered addresses, family connections, scandals, everything, but Farish was downstairs lying in a coma and not expected to live the night. Across from the elevator, Eugene stopped at the nurse's station. Nobody there. He leaned for a while on the counter and pretending to inspect a photo collage, a spider plant in a gift basket. He waited. Dufresne, even before his word with the nurse, the episode in the hallway, and particularly the old lady whose crispness reeked money and Baptist position, had convinced him that the child wasn't one of Odom's. And this was too bad, because if the girl belonged to Odom, it would have fit neatly with certain of his suspicions. Odom had good reason to get back at Farish and Danny. Presently, the nurse emerged from the child's room, and when she did, she gave Eugene a look. She was a pretty girl, but all reddened up with lipstick and paint like the horse's ass. Eugene turned casually with a casual wave and then sauntered off back down the hall and down the stairs past the night nurse. Desk light shining spookily up into her face, down to the windowless waiting room for intensive care, where the shaded lamps glowed round the clock with a muted glow, where Gum and Curtis slept on the couch. There was no point in hanging around upstairs and calling attention to himself. He would go back upstairs once that painted-up whore went off shift. Allison, at home, in bed, lay on her side staring out the window at the moon. She was scarcely conscious of Harriet's empty bed. Stripped nude, vomity sheets piled in a heap on the floor. In her mind, she was singing to herself, not so much a song as an impromptu series of low-pitched notes that repeated with variations up and down monotonously, and on like the song of some mournful, unknown night bird. Whether Harriet was there or not hardly made a difference to her, but presently, encouraged by the stillness on the other side of the room, she began to hum aloud, random tones and phrases that spiraled on in the darkness. She was having a hard time falling asleep, though she didn't know why. Sleep was Allison's refuge. It welcomed her with open arms the moment she lay down, but now she lay on her side, open-eyed and untroubled, humming to herself in the darkness, and sleep was a shadowy, forgetful distance, a curling like smoke in abandoned attics, and a singing like the sea in a pearly shell. Edie, on her cot by Harriet's bed, was awakened by the light in her face. It was late, 8:15 by her wristwatch, and she had an appointment with the accountant at 9. She got up and went into the bathroom, and her wan, drained reflection in the mirror stopped her for a moment. It was mostly the fluorescent light, but still. She brushed her teeth and gamely set to work on her face, penciling her eyebrows, drawing in her lips. Edie did not trust doctors. In her experience, they didn't listen, preferring instead to strut around pretending that they had all the answers. They jumped to conclusions. They ignored what didn't fit with their theories, and this doctor was a foreigner on top of everything. The instant he'd heard the word seizure, this Dr. Dagu, or whatever his name was, The child's other symptoms faded into an insignificance. They were questionable. Questionable, thought Edie, exiting the bathroom and examining her sleeping granddaughter with intent curiosity, as if Harriet were a diseased shrub or a mysteriously sickened houseplant, because epilepsy ain't what's wrong with her. With academic interest, she studied Harriet for several moments longer, then went back into the bathroom to dress. Harriet was a hardy child, and Edie was not terribly worried about her, except in a generalized sort of way. What did worry her, and what had kept her open-eyed on the hospital cot for much of the night, was the disastrous state of her daughter's house. Now that Edie thought about it, she had not actually been upstairs since Harriet was just a little thing. Charlotte was a pack rat, and the tendency, Edie knew, had increased since Robin's death, but the condition of the house had shocked her thoroughly. Squalor, there was no other word. No wonder the child was sick with garbage and trash all over the place. It was a wonder they weren't all three in the hospital. Edie, zipping up the back of her dress, bit the inside of her cheek. Dirty dishes, piles of newspapers, towers of it, certain to attract vermin. Worst of all, the smell. All sorts of unpleasant scenarios had threaded through Edie's mind as she lay awake, turning this way and that way on the lumpy hospital cot. The child might have been poisoned or contracted hepatitis. She might have been bitten by a rat in her sleep. Edie had been too stunned and ashamed to confide any of these suspicions to a strange doctor, and she still was, even in the cold light of morning. What was one to say? Oh, by the way, doctor, my daughter keeps a filthy house. There would be roaches and worse. Something had to be done before Grace Fountain or some other nosy neighbor called the health department. Confronting Charlotte when the only mean excuses and tears. An appeal to the adulterous Dix was risky, because if it came to divorce, and it might, the squalor would only give Dix an edge in court. Why on earth had Charlotte let the colored woman go? Edie pinned her hair back, swallowed a couple of aspirin with a glass of water. Her ribs hurt mightily after the night on the cot, and stepped out into the room again. All roads lead to the hospital, she thought. Since Libby's death, she had been returning to the hospital nightly in her dreams, wandering the corridors, riding the elevator up and down, searching for floors and room numbers that didn't exist. And now it was daytime, and here she was again, in a room very like the one. Libby had died. Harriet was still asleep, which was fine. The doctor had said she'd sleep most of the day. After the accountant and yet another morning wasted in poring through Judge Cleave's books, which were written practically in cipher, she had to meet with the lawyer. He was urging her to settle this awful Mr. Rixey person, which was all well and good, except that the reasonable compromise he was suggesting would leave her practically destitute. Lost in thought, Mr. Rixey had not even accepted the reasonable compromise. She would find out today if he had. Edie gave herself one last glance in the mirror, got her purse, and walked out of the room without noticing the preacher, loitering at the end of the hall. The bed sheets felt cool and delicious. Harriet lay in the morning light with her eyes tight shut. She had been dreaming of stone steps in a bright grassy field, steps that led nowhere. Steps so crumbled with age that they might have been boulders tumbled and sunken in the buzzing pasture. The needle was a hateful ping in the crook of her elbow, silver and chill, cumbrous apparatus winding away from it, up through the ceiling and into the white skies of dream. For some minutes she hung between sleep and waking. Footsteps knocked across the floor, cold corridors echoing like palaces, and she lay very still, hoping that some kindly official would walk over and take notice of her. Harriet, small, Harriet, pale and ill. The footsteps neared the bed and stopped. Harriet sensed a presence leaning over her. Quiet, she lay there, eyelids fluttering, allowing herself to be examined. Then she opened her eyes and started back in horror at the preacher, whose face was inches from her own. His scar stood out a bright turkey wattle red beneath the melted tissue of the brow bone. His eyes shone wet and fierce. "Be quiet now," he said, with a parrot-like cock of his head. His voice was high and sing-song with an airiness to it. "Ain't no need of making noise in it." Harriet would have liked to make noise, a lot of it. Frozen with fear and confusion, she stared up at him. "I know who you are." His mouth moved very little as he spoke. "You was at the mission that night." Harriet cut her eyes over at the empty doorway. Pain flicked through her temples like electricity. The preacher furrowed his brow at her as he leaned closer. "You was messing with them snakes. I think it was you that let 'em loose, wasn't it?" he said in his curious high-pitched voice. His hair pomade smelled like lilac. "And you was following my brother Danny, wasn't you?" Harriet stared at him. Did he know about the tower? "How come you run from me in the hall back there?" He didn't know. Harriet was careful to sit very still. At school, nobody could beat her in the game, where the kids tried to outstare each other. Dim bells clanged in her head. She wasn't well. She longed to rub her eyes, start the morning over. Something about the position of her own face as opposed to the preacher's didn't make sense. It was as if he were a reflection she ought to be seen from a different angle. The preacher squinted at her. "You're a bold little piece," he said, "bold as brass." Harriet felt weak and giddy. "He doesn't know," she told herself fiercely. "He doesn't know." There was a call button for the nurse on the side of her bed, and though she wanted very badly to turn her head and look at it, she forced herself to keep still. He was watching her closely. Beyond the whiteness of the room swept away into airy distances, an emptiness just as sickening as it in its way as the close darkness of the water tank. "Look a here," he said, leaning even closer. "What you so scared of? Ain't nobody laid a finger on you." Rigidly, Harriet looked up in his face and did not flinch. "Maybe you done something to be scared of then. I want you to know what you was up to, sneaking around my house. And if you don't tell me, I'm on find out." Suddenly, a cheerful voice said from the doorway, "Knock, knock." Hastily, the preacher straightened and turned around. There, waving from the doorway, stood Roy Dial with some Sunday school booklets and a box of candy. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything," said Mr. Dial, striding in unafraid. He was in casual dress instead of the suit and tie that he wore to Sunday school, all sporty in his deck shoes and khakis. A whiff about him of Florida and SeaWorld. "Why, Eugene, what are you doing here?" "Mr. Dial," the preacher sprang to offer his hand. His tone had changed, charged with a new kind of energy, and even in her illness and fright, Harriet noted this. "He's afraid," she thought. "Ah, yes." Mr. Dial looked at Eugene. "Wasn't a Ratliff admitted yesterday in the newspaper?" "Yes, sir. My brother Farsh." Eugene, made a visible effort to slow down. "Well, he's been shot, sir." "Shot?" thought Harriet, dazed. "Shot in the neck, sir. They found him last night. Well, my goodness," cried Dr. Dial gaily. Mr. Dial gaily, rearing back with a drollery which told how little he cared to hear about Eugene's family. "Goodness gracious, I sure do hate that. I'll be sure and stop in and see him as soon as he feels a little better. Without giving Eugene the chance to explain that Farsh wasn't going to get better, Mr. Dial threw up his hands as if to say, "What do you do?" and set down the box of candy on the nightstand. "I'm afraid this isn't for you, Harriet," he said in dolphiny profile, leaning in cozily at her with his left eye. "I was just running out before work to visit with dear Agnes Upchurch." Miss Upchurch was a rickety old Baptist invalid, a banker's widow, high on Mr. Dial's list of prospects for the building fund. "And who should I bump into downstairs but your grandmother?" "Why, my goodness," I said. "Miss Edith." The preacher, Harriet noticed, was edging towards the door. Mr. Dial saw her looking at him and turned. "And how do you know this fine young lady?" The preacher, arrested in his retreat, made the best of it. "Yes, sir," he said, rubbing at the back of his neck with one hand and stepping back to Mr. Dial's side, as if that was what he had meant to do all along. "Well, sir, I was here when they brung her in last night. Too weak to walk. She was a mighty sick little girl, and that's the truth." This he said with a conclusive air, as if further explanation could not possibly be necessary. And so you were just, Mr. Dial looked as if he could hardly bring himself to say it, visiting with Harriet here? Eugene cleared his throat and looked away. There's my brother, sir, he said, and while I'm out here, I might as well try to visit and bring some comfort to others. It's a joy to get out amongst the little ones and pour out that precious seed. Mr. Dial looked at Harriet as if to say, has this man been bothering you? It don't take nothing but a sneeze and a Bible. You know, said Eugene, nodding at the television set, that there's the greatest detriment in a child's salvation you can have in the house. The sin box is what I call it. Mr. Dial, said Harriet suddenly, and her voice sounded thin and far away. Where's my grandmother? Downstairs, I think, said Mr. Dial, fixing her with his chilly porpoise eyes on the telephone. What's the matter? I don't feel good, said Harriet truthfully. The preacher, she noticed, was easing out of the room. When he saw Harriet watching him, he gave her a look before he slid away. What's the matter, said Mr. Dial, bending down over her, overwhelming her with his sharp, fruity aftershave. Do you want water? Do you want some breakfast? Are you sick to your stomach? Aye, Harriet struggled to sit up. What she wanted, she couldn't ask for. Not in so many words. She was afraid of being left alone, but she could not think exactly how to tell Mr. Dial this without telling him what she was afraid of and why. Just at that instant, the telephone at her bedside rang. Here, let me get that, said Mr. Dial, snatching up the receiver and passing it to her. Mama, said Harriet faintly. Congratulations, a brilliant coup. It was Healy. His voice, though exuberant, was tinny and remote. From his hiss on the line, Harriet knew he was calling from the Saint's phone in his bedroom. Harriet, ha, man, you destroyed him. You nailed him. Aye, Harriet's brain wasn't working at top speed, and she couldn't think quick enough what to say. Despite the connection, his hoots and yelps were so loud on the other end that Harriet feared Mr. Dial could hear him. Way to go. In his excitement, he dropped the phone with an enormous clatter. His voice rushed back at her, breathy, deafening. It was in the paper. What? I knew it was you. What are you doing in the hospital? What happened? Are you hurt? Are you shot? Harriet cleared her throat in a special way they had, which meant she wasn't free to talk. Oh, right, said Healy after a somber pause. Sorry. Mr. Dial, taking his candy, mouthed at her. I have to run. No, don't, said Harriet in sudden panic, but Mr. Dial kept right on backing out the door. See you later, he mouthed with bright gesticulations. I gotta go sell me some cars. Just answer yes or no then, Healy was saying. Are you in trouble? Fearfully, Harriet gazed at the empty doorway. Mr. Dial was far from the kindest or most understanding of adults, but at least he was competent. All rectitude and pickiness, sweet moral outrage itself. Nobody would dare to hurt her if he was around. Are they going to arrest you as a policeman on guard? Healy, can you do something for me? She said. Sure, he said, serious, suddenly, alert as a terrier. Harriet, an eye on the door, said, promise, though she was half whispering. Her voice carried farther than she wanted it to in the frosty silence, all for Micah and slickness. What? I can't hear you. Promise me first. Harriet, come on, just tell me. At the water tower. Harriet took a deep breath. There was no way to say it without coming right out and saying it. There's a gun lying on the ground. I need you to go. A gun? To get it and throw it away, she said hopelessly. Why even bother keeping her voice down? Who knew who was listening on his end or even hers? She just watched the nurse walk past the door. Now here came another, glancing in curiously as she passed. Geez, Harriet. Healy, I can't go. She felt like crying. But I've got band practice and we have to stay late today. Band practice, Harriet's heart sank. How was this ever going to work? Or, Healy was saying, or I could go now if I hurry. Mom's dropping me off in half an hour. Wanly, Harriet smiled at the nurse who put her head in at the door. What difference was it going to make either way? Leave her father's gun on the ground for the police to find, or let Healy go get it. It would be all over the band hall by noon. What am I supposed to do with it? Healy was saying. Hide it in your yard? No, said Harriet so sharply that the nurse raised her eyebrows. Throw it. Geez, she thought, closing her eyes. Just go ahead and say it. Throw it in the river? Healy inquired helpfully. Right, said Harriet, shifting as the nurse, a big square woman with stiff gray hair and large hands, reached over to plump her pillow. What if it won't sink? It took a moment for this to register. Healy repeated the question as the nurse unhooked Harriet's chart off the foot of the bed and departed with a heavy, side-swaying gait. It's metal, said Harriet. Healy, she realized with a shock, was talking to somebody on the other end. Rapidly, he came back on. All right, gotta go. Click. Harriet sat with the dead phone to her ear, sat stunned, until the dial tone came on, and fearfully, for she had never taken her eyes from the doorway, not for a moment, hung up the receiver and settled back on the pillows, looking about the room in apprehension. When's the next break? Not for a long time, so I'm going to keep with my plan and stop reading right. Yeah.